So to start off with, this is a presentation that forms part of a much broader project that I'm working on with Leah Cantor, of whom you saw a photo earlier. Some of you might have recognized her. And this is a particular subsection of that with a few of my own kind of interests around Ben Kies as a very interesting historical figure, who I'll talk more about a little bit later. And the sort of the broader project is, in a very brief sentence, arguing that there's no such thing as Western philosophy. And I'll talk more about that as we go through the presentation. So there are lots of ways to kind of get into this, different approaches to take. In the South African context, there's a big discussion about decolonizing philosophy in particular, that has reached the UK in part, but as we heard earlier, is still sort of tied up in these questions of, are we talking about colonialism or are we talking about diversification? What all of these things mean? I'm going to slightly skip that and approach it from a different angle in terms of legitimacy debates. And so one entry point to that was very helpfully introduced in Philippe's presentation, where he talked about the quite famous Van Norden and Garfield article of, if philosophy won't diversify, let's call it what it really is, Western philosophy. And I think that's a mistake because there's no such thing as Western philosophy. But to sort of angle into that and to think about it from kind of the perspective of legitimacy debates, there have been a whole lot of these kinds of discussions over the years and decades, and in some cases centuries, as to whether there really is such a thing as all different kinds of philosophy. So you have a sampling of such things there. And there are different ways that this gets explained when it indeed is actually explained. And it's usually primarily discussed from the perspective of, let's just say, the third world or the global south, or what is sometimes labeled as non-Western philosophy, which again, bit of a problem there. So I think the kind of ways that this gets cashed out is quite variable, but often there's this idea of something that is particularly distinctive, but at the same time sufficiently similar to what we ordinarily constitute as philosophy, for it to count as philosophy on the one hand, but be particularly different enough to not just be a repeat of what we already sort of have in philosophy departments. And so this engages very much with what Philippe was saying about structural Eurocentrism, but also incorporates this kind of question that is sometimes asked of like, well, if you're not Western philosophy or if you're not proper philosophy, what is it that you bring to the table? What is different about what you're doing? And then there are all of these different boundary markings. Again, kind of Philippe presented this in a structural sense. Just a few of the ways that this actually sometimes gets cashed out is, there are things like philosophy is questioning and critique of received wisdom. It isn't simply repeating tradition. So there's a not philosophy as being traditional and a philosophy as being kind of questioning of that. There's in particular kind of a religious versus secular or scientific distinction. I'll talk more about some of these as we go. And there are basically just a whole lot of ways that this does get explained, if ever it is in fact explained. And often, and I want to come back to this later as well, often it simply isn't explained at all. Okay, so this is kind of the broad picture. There's like a very extensive debate about this in African philosophy, although it is worth noting that that debate itself has somewhat shifted over time, from a kind of, does this thing exist at all, to a, what is particularly African or distinctively African about this form of philosophy. But the same kinds of debates happen in Latin America, in particular with indigenous thought. There's also a very interesting extra dynamic around people dismissing it for not being, a textual tradition and an oral tradition, while erasing the epistemicide of the destruction of written knowledge in Latin America through colonialism. And many of interestingly, the debates about Latin American philosophy have entered into these debates about African philosophy as well. And sort of there are works in African philosophy talking about the legitimacy of African philosophy that refer back to these debates that have taken place about Latin American philosophy as well. You find similar things with Indian and Chinese philosophy, which is particularly odd because in these cases, you actually do have extensive written traditions which meet many of the criteria that people ordinarily reserve for what is proper philosophy that I sort of flagged earlier. And I'm not going to go into the detail about this, but simply to sort of point out that these kinds of legitimacy debates take place not only for kind of things that look quite different from what is ordinarily classed as Western philosophy, but also for things that even sometimes converge with and look very similar to some things that we find in sort of mainstream philosophy. But the reason for going through this is actually simply as an entry point for what I really want to talk about, which is to say all of these legitimacy debates basically happen around anything that isn't Western philosophy. But we do not have a debate about what is Western philosophy and whether that in fact exists. So polemically, you might have seen in the uh, program thing, I sort of put it as like, well, I actually think all of these other philosophies exist. I don't think Western philosophy exists. And that's what I'm going to try and convince you of today. But I think what's particularly significant here is that Western philosophy as a kind of an idea or a category, something like that, is the standard against which everything else is measured. And so this is what you sort of hold up as like, this is really philosophy. Does this match or meet these criteria, whichever criteria we decide to use? Most of the discussions of Western philosophy that take place tend to take the concept or the category for granted and then argue that it is racist, imperialist, colonial, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, but leave intact the category. So, there's Chinese philosophy and there's Indian philosophy and so on. And through those lenses, perhaps, or through immanent critique within Western philosophy, we can argue that these exclusions in Western philosophy are racist or xenophobic or Eurocentric or whatever the case is. But the category of Western philosophy itself is left intact. And so what I think is particularly interesting about all of this as like an entry point into this discussion is the question, does Western philosophy actually exist, is just not asked. And Lucy Allais, now a colleague of mine at WITS, wrote a very interesting paper in 2016 where she points out that this is simply not a question which has concerned Western philosophy very much, or so-called Western philosophy. It is simply assumed to exist. And this is then repeated in institutional mechanisms, not only in the sort of academic institutions, but in popular ideas around this as well, right? So it's very obvious that Western philosophy exists. Although the meeting is being recorded, you can tell that's a Wikipedia page of Western philosophy. And if there's a Wikipedia page of something, obviously it's real, right? So, I mean, I think there's a point of connection in terms of the unasked questions and the taken for granted practices that corresponds to what Philippe was saying as well. But I think using this level of obviousness of what Western philosophy is supposed to be, we can see a few features that kind of emerge as quite regularly discussed when people discuss Western philosophy, although these are very rarely actually argued for and kind of presented as, this is why this category holds together and so on. So the first one is a obviously Greek origin to philosophy. And there are various, versions of this. My co-author Leo has written a very good paper on how like Thales is understood in the history of philosophy as the father of philosophy. But there are other people who, pointed to Parmenides or to this one, or, Plato or Socrates or someone else. But the point is pretty much all of these understandings of what Western philosophy is supposed to be start in Greece. And there's usually some kind of like mythos to logos story that accompanies this, where you move from superstition and irrationality and religion and maybe theology and a whole bunch of other things that are not philosophy to some kind of secular reasoning, rational, argumentative, logical, something, 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 which is supposed to be the hallmarks of the birth of philosophy. The second thing that is common to a lot of the ways that Western philosophy is presented, again, not argued for, is that it is simply continuous. The Plato to NATO story, which of course is under some controversy in terms of the NATO side of things these days. But in any case, there's this kind of idea that this is just this continuous picture, mostly in Europe and then also maybe North America. And occasionally we might recognize the settler colonies in the global south like Australia and New Zealand. And the third thing that is less commonly even explicitly mentioned in these stories, but is implicit to how the stories are presented, is that this is basically an entirely European affair, that there is no engagement with anything outside of Europe and in Europe, there's a sort of like hermetically sealed, as Christoph Scheringer puts it, sort of hermetically sealed history of philosophy that takes place entirely within Europe. And maybe, sure, some people occasionally dabbled in some interesting things outside, like Heidegger, but they didn't really get influenced by it that much. It's still a pretty European affair. Okay, so much for the kind of obvious and implicit standard narratives. The Like I said, it's extremely rare to find this actually explicitly discussed. One of the few cases where I have found it is Antony Flou's Introduction to Western Philosophy, first published in the 70s, a new edition more recently, and does exactly the moves that we've seen in some of the earlier presentations, that Western philosophy simply is philosophy. There isn't really anything else to include in the category of philosophy. Flou is an interesting one because he states and asserts and does not argue that philosophy is concerned first, last, and all the time with argument, and then claims that this is uniquely Western, and is also true of all of Western philosophy, which again is not an argument that he makes, he just asserts it. And then also goes on to assert that most of what is labeled Eastern philosophy is not so concerned, i.e., with argument. He's not Eurocentric, he's not parochial. It's just that Eastern philosophy doesn't really do arguments. Nobody has ever really argued outside of Europe, apparently. And on that basis, his introduction to Western philosophy, which is an introduction to philosophy as such, draws no materials from any sources east of Suez, which is I'm sure there's some historically interesting reason as to why he mentions Suez. Okay, so these are the kinds of ideas around what Western philosophy is supposed to be that you find either implicitly or much more rarely explicitly in kind of philosophical texts. And if you start to map these out, you can already see some kind of interesting things. So you have the Greeks, you have the Romans, we ignore that part, and then you have the kind of Renaissance, Enlightenment, and then kind of modern philosophy. And so there is an obvious question mark as to, did nobody ever philosophize prior to Thales? And of course, what was going on in the 600 to 700 years between about Augustine and Anselm and so on. I find visualizing this extremely useful, in part because when you're actually reading a history of philosophy, sometimes you can get a little bit of whiplash. Like you're on page 120 and you're like at the end of the Romans and you're talking about Augustine and you turn the page and suddenly you're 700 years later and you're like, was there an editorial mistake? Like, did we just miss like a third of the entire picture? But you see it much more sort of viscerally in graphical form. So that is so that's the kind of picture that you get when you visualize it. And I would sort of encourage you to go back to the histories of philosophy that you've worked with in your own life and take a look, because this kind of a picture with variations is true of the most widely used history of philosophy, although, of course, historians of philosophy tend to hate Bertrand Russell's work. It is still something that has sold something like 20, 30 million copies since it was first published in the late 40s, early 50s. So this is still hugely influential today. I even saw it at the bookstore at the airport in Johannesburg on my way here, which is extremely rare to find any works of philosophy at a bookstore in South Africa. But you kind of have this picture popularized, particularly by Bertrand Russell, popularized again by Brian McGee, host of a very famous radio series in the UK in about the, I think, 70s or 80s. In more recent works like Anthony Kenny's New History of Western Philosophy, one of the most recent sort of comprehensive histories, A.C. Grayling's The History of Philosophy, which incidentally has a very interesting subtitle, 3 Millennia of Thought from the West and Beyond. And as well as things like anthologies, so-called unconventional histories of Western philosophy, which attempt to bring in women to the picture, which is obviously also excluded from most of these histories of philosophy/Western philosophy. And this is also not only true of kind of unconventional histories in the global north, but one of the most widely used texts in Brazil, for example, Marcondes's kind of introduction to the history of philosophy gives pretty much the same picture as well. This is, I should mention, also the story that more or less, I was told implicitly in my own undergrad in South Africa, and a bunch of others, right? So this is basically a very common story that you get. And this is really weird in many ways, one of which is that the idea of the West has been critiqued in the rest of the humanities and social sciences for decades, perhaps most famously by Stuart Hall in the early 90s. And then much more recently, there have been a slew of these kinds of critiques and challenges, mostly by historians in kind of various languages, mostly focused on publications in Europe. And a lot of these are people with an interest in philosophy, but not necessarily people critiquing or even like really engaging much with the idea of Western philosophy. So there are these critiques in the remainder of the humanities, but philosophy seems a little behind on asking these kinds of questions. There are a few people who have done some of this work. Lucy Allais, I mentioned earlier, Christoph Scheringa, I mentioned earlier, have been kind of most directly involved in this. There are a few other people, Eric Nelson, Sean Megu, have discussed aspects of this, features on a page or two, like maybe we should actually question this, but it's not like central to the argument of the text in question. And the earliest I'll be talking about for the remainder of this, so I won't go into that in more detail now. And then, of course, Leah and my work has started cropping up in the last couple of years. This talk is a modification of the Ben Kies paper in the British Journal for the History of Philosophy. So if you're interested in some of the more details, take a look at that. And yeah, I won't simply repeat the paper. There's quite a lot of other bits in this presentation. And so more recently, we've also been doing some work with some of the people who've already been mentioned, including Catherine Koning-Pralong and a few others. And we're working on getting some more publications out. So there's more from this project coming soon, but I won't just self-aggrandize. Okay, so Ben Kies. I find him, like I said, very interesting as a person, very interesting as a political thinker, but amazingly, he also happens to be, as far as we can make out, basically the first person to argue that Western philosophy does not exist. There is something that I spotted, well, I was introduced to a few weeks ago. John Dewey in 1951 had a one-page sort of intro to the first edition of Philosophy East and West, where he kind of says, maybe we shouldn't think in terms of East and West. It's very brief, it's very interesting, but it is essentially just what I've said. It's one page. It's not much more than that. And interestingly, although Ben Kies is writing about this in the 1950s, nobody seems to have picked up on his work in the last 70 or so years. The next most recent, Lucy Allais, interestingly, also a South African, writes about this in 2016 in the wake of the Fees Must Fall movements and Rhodes Must Fall movements, calling for the decolonization of knowledge in South Africa. So there's an entire other socio-political history, which I work on in another life and with another hat, and which is very interesting to observe, but isn't the focus right now. So I think the main thing that I think is worth taking from Kies at this point, apart from his critiques of Western philosophy, that he doesn't only provide a kind of critical assessment of, this thing is nonsense, it's just ideology, but also provides us with an alternative way of understanding the history of philosophy and how we can make sense of it even today. So I'll introduce some of that in a moment as well. But it is also worth mentioning, before I get into a few more biographical things, that both Kies as an individual figure and the political movement that he was a part of, the unity movement in South Africa, are almost forgotten today, I mean, including in South Africa. So this is not particularly well-known stuff, including to South Africans working in politics, philosophy, sociology, and so on. Okay, who was Ben Kies? I've hyped him up a little bit already. I think there's a lot more hyping to do. He was, most broadly speaking, a South African socialist teacher, high school teacher, later in life a lawyer, and broadly construed an activist-theorist. Importantly, he was not an academic, and he was not based in a university with the work that he was doing. And I think that is important for understanding how and why he can say the things that he says. There's some more details about his activism, his teaching, his trade union activities. but broadly speaking, involved in kind of anti-colonial and anti-apartheid movements in South Africa. And as an activist, contributes hugely to organizing in that context, but also to theorizing the conditions in which he's working and living and struggling in. And there are all sorts of things which Crane Sudin and I think it's Christopher Lee talk about as kind of contributions that he makes that sort of prefigure a whole lot of developments in the humanities that take place in almost some cases decades later. Thanks. One brief bit of research that I haven't kind of written about at all recently, but I think is really interesting. He spends a very brief amount of time doing a master's in education at the University of London's, now I think it's UCL, Institute of Education. And the tutor, who to basically everyone else is incredibly obnoxious and very rude, basically says this person can't think, they shouldn't be doing a master's. Writes of Ben Kies, he has a keen and critical mind, is fearless in criticism and just in judgment. So I think that gives you just a very tiny taste of the person. But what of his work? So the text that I'm going to be focusing on in this presentation is a 1953 speech, which is really, really interesting in all sorts of ways, one of which is just at the kind of contextual level. This is not a speech to academics. This is a speech that he gives to his trade union, which is the Teachers League of South Africa, which is a pretty militant and kind of anti-colonial union, especially by the 1950s. And so what he's doing is working with teachers as organic intellectuals to think about how do we raise a generation of anti-colonial and anti-apartheid activists through how we teach and what we teach, and through challenging the kinds of ideas that keep people in their place. So in this context, he talks about one of the more important tasks of our time, which is sadly still incomplete 70 years later, is to dissect the myth of European or white or Western or Christian civilization and to give our reply to it on the level of ideas and the field of practice. And so this is really the kind of overall emphasis of what he's trying to accomplish in this talk. So the kind of core sections or features of the argument, I suppose, are firstly that the idea of Western civilization and within that and connected to that, the idea of Western philosophy are basically just a recasting of racial mythology. And I'll talk more about that in a moment. And he alludes to, and in some cases a bit more explicit about, the very idea of sort of civilizational block thinking. So European civilization, Chinese civilization, these are mistakes. These are sort of errors in our thinking. And this leads us, in part with other kind of factors, to some of the basically colonial and racist dynamics that are at play in the political sort of structures that he's engaged in. The second thing that I think is really interesting and worth kind of noting, especially for the argument I'm trying to draw out with this, is that a lot of the stuff is a really recent fabrication. So it's not that, you know, everybody since Plato has thought of themselves as a Western philosopher. In fact, what he says is that it's basically only from about 1945 that this way of thinking about the world really takes root. He's not entirely right about that, but I'll get into that in a moment. But I think that's really interesting, especially for somebody writing in 1953, right? He's observing the conditions around him at the time and saying, you know, this is something new and it's something that is nonsense. And the third part, which is going to feature in the argument I'll raise a little bit later as well, is that this is the product of a distorted history. And so it is a form of Eurocentrism, although if I remember correctly, he doesn't use exactly that word, but it is a form of Eurocentrism that has produced this category. And as a result of that, we can't keep using the category. It's grounded on extremely shaky and sort of dodgy ground. So it's an untenable category for historical understanding. Okay, so that's the kind of overview of what he has to say. I should say that the focus of this presentation that he gives is not about philosophy, although philosophy features very strongly in it. Really, the focus is the idea of race, and he's trying to create an argument that says that there is no really, that really, when it comes down to it, there is no such thing. That this is simply an ideological justification, or as he puts it, a kind of a rationalization of colonial plunder. It is the European conquering powers attempt to justify what they've done by saying, well, we can take from this part of the world, from these people, we can colonize these lands, we can enslave those people because somehow they're inferior. And how that manifests over time is kind of variable. But broadly speaking, this idea of race as a racial hierarchy is an ideological weapon that is simply a sort of, like I said, rationalization or justification. Interestingly, he says that the sort of like height of this, and this corresponds to a lot of other anti-colonial thinkers, Aimé Césaire most famously, that this is the sort of apex of this is when it is brought back home and doesn't just stay off there in the colonies, but is actually brought back home in Nazi ideology, and what he terms the Nordic myth of an Aryan race. And again, this is very much linked to the idea of independent civilizations, which sort of operate as these impermeable blocks, and kind of race as one really core aspect of what constitutes a civilization. Okay, so that's the kind of background. He then goes on to argue that one part of this myth of Western civilization is the idea of Western philosophy, and that has a really central operative role in justifying these hierarchies. As we've heard in previous presentations, this kind of idea of if people can't think, then they can't think, they can't philosophize, therefore they are inferior. And that's part of the kind of logical concatenation that takes place in this construction of civilizational narratives, as well as kind of how philosophy is brought into that. Train Sudin, who's busy at the moment writing a biography of Ben Kies, and is definitely worth reading on this as well, talks about how this is almost unheard of anywhere in the world at the time. And this kind of systematic demolishing of the idea of both Western civilization and, again, built into that, the idea of Western philosophy. So to give you a sense of sort of how he argues this, a lot of it is somewhat poetic and quite beautifully written. Since the defeat of the Nordic Axis, so at the end of the Second World War, two of the victors, America and Britain, resurrected and reminted the Nordic myth, which is now presented as Western civilization, European, white, Christian, whenever divine agreement is deemed suitable. There is supposedly a Western man with a Western soul, a Western philosophy, a Western science, a Western way of life, whose gospel opens with the words, "In the beginning was the West." And again, that is traced back to ancient Greece. So again, he's arguing that this is a very recent fabrication, that it's sort of like, certainly for his time, it's less than a decade old. Is he right about that? So if we do a little bit of bibliometric work with Google Ngrams, uh, the short answer is yes, he's pretty much on point. There's a longer answer, which I've written about in the paper if you want to take a look at that. And there's a particular oddity to do with Germany, which I'll talk about more in a moment. Um, but essentially, one of the kind of key things here is he's not correct in a literal sense of saying this is invented in 1945, but he is basically correct in saying that this really takes root and kind of like gets popular. Popular. These are academic books mostly, but it gains currency, let's say, from the 40s onwards, in particular. Different way of looking at this is using sort of Web of Science, Scopus, JSTOR, and so on. The key thing to look at is really the bottom section over here, where prior to 1918, there are 34 mentions of Western philosophy in the over 1 million texts digitized across these different platforms. So it's, I mean, really almost unheard of. There is another point to mention here. Eric Schlieser has pointed out very usefully that a lot of these uses of what Western philosophy is are super idiosyncratic. Definitely the weirdest one that I found, which I really liked, was saying that, who was it? Oh, I don't have the name here. I think it was Thoreau had invented a new Western philosophy, and that's what Western philosophy is, because it had something to do with moving westwards across the United States. So yeah, again, these uses prior to 1918 really do not map on to what we sort of take for granted as being Western philosophy and the kind of general picture that I showed you earlier. between the wars, there is a slight uptick, and it's really only from 1945 that this enters again kind of widespread currency in journal articles and things digitized by these different platforms. So I think this sort of gives us some evidence that Kies is broadly on the right track, even if not entirely accurate. And again, if we were to map this, that's basically that red bar over there is the time period in the history observed where people are talking about Western philosophy, and Kies is right in the middle of it saying, this is nonsense. We don't really need this idea, and it's very dodgy. Okay, so that's the sort of, let's call it what humanities students pass for quantitative side of things. What's on the qualitative side, there have been a series of books about the idea of the West, not only the kinds of histories that I showed you earlier, but kind of grappling with, where does this come from, doing textual analysis, what's going on here. And I think some of the things that are coming up in this literature actually really justify Kies's argument as well. Again, the timing is slightly off sometimes, but Gwilt and Bonnet, for example, point out how it's really a product of British imperialism that gets a little bit shaky around calling things white civilization in the late 1800s and sort of uses Western as a slightly more neutral sounding term. But essentially, these things are used fairly interchangeably in the late 1800s, early 1900s. There's also very interesting, and I sort of flagged Germany as being a bit of an outsider. There are several words in German which could translate to Western. I think it's Westliche and Abendländischen, something along those lines. My German is even worse than whoever mentioned their German earlier. But Germany itself was not obviously a part of the West until about the 1950s. And even then, it was just West Germany, because what the West meant was not communism. So that's kind of significant for how we sort of make sense of what's going on historically in sort of more fine-grained detail. And I'm not going to go into more detail about this right now because I still have quite a few slides. To go back to one final example, though, Antony Flew, I think, is a really interesting case for understanding like what's going on here. This is the "There's Nothing East of Suez" guy I mentioned earlier. Antony Flew also happened to be the vice president of what was called the Western Goals Institute, which is a really interesting organization. So one of the things that they do is write a newspaper article about how much they love Latin American dictatorships and how throwing people out of helicopters is like the road to freedom. I'm not joking. This is, you can go and take a look at it. And they also invite a whole lot of very interesting characters to come and speak, guests of honor at their like annual dinners and so on, including some very interesting South Africans, Andries Streinicht and Clive Derby-Lewis. Clive Derby-Lewis was responsible for the assassination of Chris Hani, one of the leading anti-apartheid figures, and nearly precipitated a civil war in the 90s in South Africa. So, and by the way, like in justification of white supremacy. So this is not like, oh, there's the West over here and there's whiteness over there. And like some people, like this is very much conceptualizing of what the West is as being a white supremacist project. Okay, so a few examples of how these things link up. To go back, though, then to the particular arguments that we can kind of understand, because right now I've basically cast a lot of aspersions on the idea of the West and on Western philosophy by extension as part of that. But if we go back and look at the actual narratives, we get a whole lot of very interesting things happening. So if we look at the argument for Greek origins, and this is really Leia's domain much more than my own, there are a ton of things to say, and I'll sprinkle a few in quite quickly. The first is that it is worth observing that a lot of these histories from Russell to Grayling basically say something like philosophy begins with Thales. Grayling is just factually incorrect, where he says Thales is regarded by the Greeks themselves and all historians of philosophy since as the father of philosophy, but there's similar things in a whole lot of other histories of philosophy. And like I mentioned earlier, this is often justified more broadly through a kind of mythos to logos shift, again, away from religion to something like rationality or science or secularism. They tend to forget the Aristotelian thing that philosophy begins in wonder because that would be too global. Okay, so there are some questions that we could ask. One, nobody's ever had a philosophical thought or a rational thought prior to that rather arbitrary date. Seems a bit weird. And there are increasingly people who are doing that kind of work, talking about, philosophy in ancient Babylonia, philosophy in ancient Egypt, although I'm not sure if Lewis Gordon's translations are entirely right, but the idea that a lover of wisdom appears in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphical texts would give credence to the idea that if what we're talking about is the lover of wisdom, that actually there is certainly a pre-Greek tradition here. And even if we're talking about things that are secular, argumentative, and a whole lot of those other, tick boxes that I mentioned earlier, you have cases from, we're not entirely sure of the dates, or at least I'm not, but roughly the same time in ancient India with Charvaka, which again basically ticks all of the boxes that people want to tick when they say there's a Greek origin to philosophy, but is conveniently ignored. Okay, so I mean, these things are all going on. It is worth noting that Kies himself does argue that all of these things are happening amongst the Phoenicians, the Babylonians, the Indians, Chinese, Egyptians, and so on. And I think one thing just to sort of like round this off, because I think it's a very useful way of expressing it from Tom Hercules Davies, is to propose that in the thousands of years of recorded history preceding Thales, nobody east of Anatolia or Suez argued in favor of a position or interrogated a traditional theory. This is deranged. It is astonishing that serious scholars permit themselves to entertain it, especially in view of the deep archive of careful and convincing work demonstrating that it is false. So I think I can put this one to bed, except to say a few other snarky remarks about how even Thales was not in what was considered something like Europe at the time, and that even in the 16 and 1700s, historians of philosophy, contra what Grayling believes, were saying that philosophy came from ancient Egypt as well. So we have all of these kinds of dynamics. Kies himself observes that the parts of Europe most advanced in civilization were those nearest to and in closest contact with Egypt and West Asia, and amusingly notes that Aristotle extols the intelligence and artistic gifts of the Asiatics, while he holds the Northerners permanently incapable of culture and statecraft for climatic reasons. So basically, Aristotle thinks that Europeans can't do philosophy, and it's part of a very dodgy theory of kind of climate racism. But Kies makes good use of that. Okay, so there are a whole lot of things going on there. But why is it that we actually believe that philosophy equals Western philosophy starts in ancient Greece? A lot of that comes from a series of figures in the late 1700s and early 1800s. And there's again a much longer story to be told here of what's going on in that context. Peter Park has an excellent book, which I'm sure most people here will be familiar with. But there's an interesting shift that happens around that time where you have sort of like maybe people before Greece had, some kind of philosophy. Maybe it wasn't really real philosophy too. Nobody had philosophy outside of Greece or before Greece. And Thales becomes a kind of an important figure in creating that starting point. It is worth noting two things, one of which is that a lot of this writing is heavily infused with racist tropes. And the second is that a lot of these same people are also the ones responsible for the exclusion of women from the history of philosophy. So if you look at some of the histories of philosophy prior to some of these figures, women occasionally figure quite prominently, although not always. But as people like Sabrina Ebersmeyer, Aileen O'Neill, and Mary Ellen Waite have pointed out, this is kind of also the time where women are pretty systematically erased from the history of philosophy. So there's something interesting going on about these different forms of erasure and the redrawing of the boundaries of what philosophy is, much like Philippe was saying, to justify your own preferred interpretation of philosophy. And in some cases, and particularly with some of the Kantians, to essentially justify why Kant was top dog and is the real philosopher, and nobody else can do philosophy unless they're basically working their way towards Kant. So a very nice teleological story. This is not the only version of the origin story that crops up. So we have the mythos to logos one, and I'm not going to go into detail on this, but simply to note that there are some very dodgy things going on there as well. There's a lot of kind of racial tropes about why this is going on, most prominently in Wilhelm Nessel, who was a card-carrying Nazi, who talks about how, this path from mythos to logos is reserved for the Aryan peoples, who are the most highly talented race. So it's not kind of incidental to racism that these narratives are emerging. It is a pretty kind of entwined connection to that form of political dynamic. Okay, so Greek origins, no. The core argument is set up in the 18th century. It's refined over the 19th and 20th century. Many of those contributions are basically racist. This is an oversimplification. There's some other things to do with religion and some other bits as well. But this is basically a really core part of that story. Interestingly, though, in a lot of the specialist scholarship, these narratives have been quietly dumped, and yet they're retained in broader histories of philosophy. So a lot of people who are introduced to philosophy are kind of still getting these kinds of narratives. Okay, Kies also has a lot to say about the kind of continuous Plato to NATO narrative, and again, like what's going on in that gap. I'm going to pretty much skip over the section because I've been told that I'm running out of time. It is worth noting for Kies, it's not only about Europe. I mean, he talks about the flourishing of sort of thought and empires and kind of political dynamics in the Americas, in China, in India, in West Africa, and so on. But simply for present purposes and focusing on what gets classed as Western philosophy, what's going on there, as Peter Adamson talks about philosophy in the Islamic world. And I have some very pretty maps and links that often get erased, even when people are recognizing this about the connections to African thinkers, especially in West Africa. There's a lot going on there. There is a paper, a sort of popular audience paper that Leah and I have written, which has a bit more of the argument there, and also looks at what it looks like a bit to fill in some of those gaps. So, who's excluded from that kind of picture. Okay, so there's that. In part, there is also the boundary work that Philippe was talking about earlier, in particular, rewriting the boundary, or sort of having a presentist view of what constitutes philosophy, and then rewriting the boundaries of philosophy so that you can, for example, exclude Islam because that's religion and theology and not philosophy. And this is taking place throughout that process, but is certainly taking place in that gap as well, which is why institutionally, when you look at particularly UK universities, where are people doing Islamic philosophy? It's often in divinity departments or some other religious studies and so on. So this boundary work is at play throughout that history as well. And then finally, the thing that is, I think, most interesting in Kies and really stands up in an interesting way today is this idea that this is an entirely European phenomenon. And so Western philosophy, okay, maybe we can include Islam, but actually it's still, we could call it European philosophy if we hate the idea of the West. And this too is not true, right? So the idea that, I mean, it's kind of funny in a way, it actually does a real disservice to European thinkers to pretend that they're these hermits that are so totally incurious about the rest of the world that they've never thought, beyond the boundaries of certainly present day Europe. And if we trace back that history, there are all sorts of adventures of various people, empires that stretch quite extensively, extensive physical sort of artifacts that are made which require advanced knowledge. It seems really weird to be like, well, there are all of these ways of interconnection, but not in philosophy. It's just in geography and history and trade and this and that, but not philosophy. That's a purely European thing. And I think this is something that Kies really helps us to think through in a kind of more systematic way, because he keeps returning throughout this text to how mixed up people and places and ideas are. So he keeps returning to, migration, people's movements, relationships that they form, trade, exchange of ideas. He highlights this amongst the ancient Greeks in Rome, amongst Christian sort of medieval thinkers in Europe, amongst the Arabs in the Iberian Peninsula, between Africa, Asia, Southern Europe. And again, these are a series of maps that sort of demonstrate this. I really like the maps, but I have run out of time, so I'm not going to spend longer on that. So what Kies then does is he gives us a sort of a pathway towards an alternative. And so he sort of flips the terms in a way that could be a little bit superficial, but I think actually contains something very interesting there. So he talks at some point later on in the presentation about it's not European civilization, but civilization in Europe, not Western civilization, but civilization in the so-called West, not Western philosophy, but the developments of these accomplishments of civilization, of humanity in a particular place and time. So there are, I think, two significant things here. One is a kind of anti-essentialist approach to it, which is, we don't start with this block of Europeans, whites, Westerners, whatever it is, and then see what that cluster or category has done, but looks at it from the perspective of a kind of an achievement of humanity under particular social conditions. And I think there's similarity there with contemporaries of his, Fanon and some others. But thinking through this he is a Marxist, and there are Marxist ways of making sense of this, thinking through it in terms of like the determinate conditions that produce certain kinds of conditions. You have an accumulation of resources which enables an amount of leisure, the sort of Aristotelian argument for this, which could be made in this kind of context. In any case, I think that's one significant way of interpreting what he's saying here. The second is the methodological one, and that is, as he puts it, a mixed history of philosophy, or a mixed history of humanity, really. In more contemporary terms, and drawing on work in history, Sanjay Subramaniam and others have written about kind of entangled histories, connected histories, and so on. And Jonathan Egged is busy working on a really interesting way of making sense of that between Zera Yaqub, if he existed in Ethiopia, and Descartes in France. More on that if you're interested down the line. And so I think if we start with this presupposition of these are entangled histories, there are connected histories, people are constantly interacting with each other, migrating, sharing ideas, and so on, we get a very different picture of the history of philosophy, right throughout various parts of that history. And some people have started writing about these kinds of ideas. David Hume maybe being inspired by Buddhist ideas, Leibniz very distinctively being inspired by work from China, more theoretically, or sort of less convincingly to some people from what I've seen, Hegel's inspiration from the Haitian Revolution, Foucault and the Black Panthers, Foucault in Tunisia. There are particular individuals who we have more or less of a sense of definitely were inspired in some of their key ideas from things that are going on from around the world. And I think that there's a significance to this, which isn't simply, there's a little minor interest here. If Kant is saying David Hume awoke me from my dogmatic slumber, and Kant is, the king of philosophy in the last 2,000 years, and David Hume is getting some of his key ideas from Buddhism, then arguably what we consider Western philosophy, is hugely inspired by Buddhism. At which point is it really Western? So I think that there is a broader argument to be constructed around these forms of entanglement, which again date back not just to individuals, but kind of moments and processes and forms of interaction throughout history. Greece and Babylonia, Greece and Egypt, Greece and India, the Islamic world and kind of Europe in the Renaissance, in early modern philosophy, in China and the sort of India and their role in the Enlightenment, right through to the kind of contemporary moment where we talk about it as this seemingly new thing of world philosophy, but in many senses has been taking place throughout history. Okay, let's move towards wrapping up. What is Western philosophy if it didn't start uniquely with the Greeks, if it didn't continue in like a neat way purely in Europe to contemporary Europe, and isn't a pure sort of hermetically sealed tradition? I have no idea. I don't know what you would consider to be Western philosophy at that point. One way you might make sense of this is to say, okay, well, write those fits in, right? Like add the Islamic world in the kind of way that it's represented here, in some of the sort of I think it's orange figures. Add Byzantium, the Eastern kind of Roman Empire, and philosophy and Latin Christendom. Add women into the picture, as is kind of the recovery project in a lot of the more feminist historiographies of philosophy. And maybe, add some pre-Greek Mediterranean stuff in as well. And then we have Western philosophy. It's just got the gaps filled in. And the problem there goes back to what sort of Kies is identifying, is that this very concept of Western civilization and Western philosophy is the conceptual outcome of a distorted history. And so we can't really make use of that concept if the foundation of it is as shaky as I think it is through what Kies has argued. And so what might be a better way of approaching it is to use the inspiration that Kies sort of presents us with and to think about a series of entangled histories of philosophy. Now, it is true that, parts of China and parts of Europe are not in contact with each other for a very long period of history. So this isn't a suggestion that everything is entangled fully all the time throughout history. But it is to trace those interconnections and trace those forms of exchange from kind of ancient times to the present day. And in doing so, I think we have to dispense with this idea of Western philosophy because it doesn't conceptually just work. I have some last sort of problems, and how we understand Western philosophy in terms of the legitimacy debates. To go back to what I was saying at the start, if we're constantly trying to understand African philosophy or Chinese philosophy in comparison to this illusory category of Western philosophy, we're always going to hit roadblocks and problems in how we try and make sense of what's going on in those particular contexts. And there are other problems with boundary marking and who has the power to evaluate whether something is philosophical or not in that process. There are some pitfalls in the kind of way forward about reifying the colonial narratives and accepting some of these things that were really just justifications for colonialism. And creating in the process of that, like I said, these further problems of false dichotomies and straitjacketing the possibilities that we have. I think there's also an interesting argument to be made about this thing of Western philosophy is actually just a distraction, right? So I think it was mentioned earlier, you have to play this dual game of like doing your modern Chinese philosophy and somehow navigating the institutional constraints of a Eurocentric institution. And a lot of that stuff is basically just a distraction from doing the work you actually want to do. Now, it's not unimportant to address the institutional side of it, but nevertheless, it is important to recognize that that is not doing the work that you're actually setting out to do. So I think there are some promises going forward, and I think I'm going to just sort of end by saying that many of the people in this room have been doing the kind of work that I think is productive and is useful going forward. I'm personally interested in the kind of global philosophy, history of philosophy connection, but a lot of the things around recategorization, around socio-meta philosophy, I think these are very useful to work with and think about as well. And yeah, I'll end there. Thanks.